latest interaction with authors of publications of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Today we're here to talk with Toby Dalton and George Perkovich from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who have authored a new monograph on Thinking the Other Unthinkable, Disarmament in North Korea and Beyond. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
To get it started, might you say, please, a little bit about your background and how you came to your interest in this subject? Toby, why don't I start with you?
So one of my formative experiences as a researcher was spending a year living in Seoul, South Korea, where I was at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies. This was in 2000 and 2001, when the agreed framework with North Korea was starting to come apart. And so I became very interested in North Korea as a problem to manage. And obviously it's a problem that the US government has been wrestling with for many decades now. And so living in Seoul, I got what I thought was a pretty firsthand view of how South Koreans thought of the problem. And then after being in South Korea, I spent the next 10 years working at the National Nuclear Security Administration on some of the nonproliferation programs there, and got to see the other part of that from the governmental perspective of challenges of thinking about and wrestling with North Korea. And that's very much carried into the work that we've been doing at Carnegie, trying to think about how you can improve distinctions between weapons programs and non-weapons programs, and in the case of North Korea, how we might roll back the North Korean program from the weapons stage that it's currently in back to something less than that. So it's been an interesting intellectual journey to see this issue evolve over time, and it's one that I feel quite close to.
George, could you give us a little bit of a sense of your background?
I guess I've been working on nuclear issues since around, 1982, when I was in Warsaw during a demonstration for the Gdansk Agreement's anniversary with Solidarity, and Soviet tanks were tear gassing people and stuff. And so that's when I got interested in arms control and US-Soviet issues. But I think on this issue that we're writing about, and in particular disarmament, it's been, again, a longstanding interest or question that I've had is, how will the nuclear age end? You could have deterrence forever, and that's optimistic and possible. For 75 years, we haven't had nuclear war. We've had deterrence. So that could go on forever. I'm a little dubious intuitively about that. And so another way it could end is with a big nuclear war. And then a third option is disarmament. And I always felt like, since so much money has been spent on preparing the deterrent and the possibility of fighting nuclear war, probably in the US, $6 trillion, millions of pages, hundreds of thousands of people working on it, and kind of noticed there's almost no one working on how could you dismantle these things? How could you do nuclear disarmament? No government, no nuclear armed state has done an actual study of how would we, our state, require nuclear disarmament to be done if we were going to find it somehow verifiable and reliable. And so I figured if everybody else is spending their time thinking the unthinkable about how you fight a nuclear war, might as well put a little effort into thinking the unthinkable about how could you dismantle these things as an option. So that basically the background.
Thank you. Might you say a little more about the background of this particular piece of work? I know it grows out of some work you were doing on North Korea.
Yeah, why don't I start? So for the last 10 years, George and colleagues and I at the Carnegie Endowment have been working with some technical experts from P5 states, including from China, to think through how you can improve the distinction between weapons programs and non-weapons nuclear programs, an effort that we called the nuclear firewall. And around 2017, our attention naturally turned to what we were seeing in North Korea, where the increase in activity and improvements in its ballistic missile programs and the nuclear tests that year really, I think, amplified the concerns and the immediacy of thinking through how you could design a negotiation that would roll back that program to something short of weapons. And so we saw an opportunity to try to apply this analytic framework that we've been developing through the Firewall project. And so over the last 3 years, we've been having regular meetings and working through a number of the challenges that you have to confront if you were to try to do that kind of negotiation. And I think a number of the takeaways from that that we deal with in the paper really start from the observation that for most people, particularly I think in the United States, we still treat this as a nonproliferation problem. But really, this is no longer just a nonproliferation problem. And so for us, superimposing the narrative of denuclearizing North Korea over what we see in disarmament discourse seemed like a good opportunity to kind of compare and contrast and see what we could learn from that exercise.
Excellent. George, would you like to add anything to that?
Just a little. I mean, I think Toby set up really nicely. I mean, I think both, as Toby said, especially the U.S. proponents or insisters on denuclearization of North Korea haven't really defined what that would mean and all of the different elements of it and how you'd verify it. And then similarly, the drafters and negotiators of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017 also didn't define actually what nuclear disarmament would entail. They didn't ask questions just to ballistic missiles remain and you just no warheads. What about laboratories? Space launch programs, yes or no? How do you do those? Nuclear power, okay, probably yes, but what about fuel cycle? Is that in or out in that kind of regime? How do you verify it? How do you monitor it? So on both sides, whether it was the DPRK denuclearization or the nuclear prohibition movement, there's still kind of an absence of at least beginning to think through in detail, what does this really mean and what would it require? And so we thought putting the two together might be an interesting thing, at least for us to do. And I think it's kind of politically interesting because you have a number of people advocating denuclearization in North Korea, but wouldn't imagine denuclearizing the US or Russia or China or India and Pakistan and seeing how those two challenges talk to each other. So that's what we tried to do.
You know, well, it was interesting to me too, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to publish this work. Can you give the group a sense of the main structure of the argument you've set out in its rough content?
Sure. We start off with this basic comparison is, should we think about North Korea as a disarmament case rather than as a nonproliferation case? And I think, we convinced ourselves that it's useful to do that. Not least because as a heuristic, it forces us to confront a number of the issues that George identified. And so we work through what the first couple phases of denuclearization negotiation would look like with North Korea. And identify a number of these hard questions. North Korea presumably would insist on retaining some fuel cycle capability, even if there's no plausible civilian rationale for it. Presumably, North Korea would insist on retaining some sort of space launch capability, even if there's no plausible rationale for it. And so we need to start to think about how you can untangle a weapons program from those enabling infrastructure questions, infrastructure pieces. And then how you would monitor and verify it. Moving forward, we then expanded the types of questions that would be confronted in negotiating disarmament among a broader set of states. What do you do about the weapons infrastructure in terms of research and development, nuclear laboratories that have been constructed mainly with weapons design and manufacturing in mind? How do you deal with the distinction between conventional military capabilities, and in particular, missile systems that have conventional military purposes, and those that would be used to deliver nuclear weapons or other WMD. And so in working through all of these questions, I think we have tried to not answer or provide a definitive answer for these things, but to at least give a sense of here are problems or challenges that negotiators and the governments behind them would have to think about and work through in order to come to some sort of agreement. We also then try to tackle two questions that often get kind of shunted to the side. One of which is, well, how would you actually monitor and verify states as they do this and measure their progress towards disarmament in a way that would still protect their security, even as they continue to maintain some kind of hedging capabilities. And then lastly, how would you enforce disarmament, given that the structure of the international system, and we're talking mainly about disarmament of P5 states, the power in that system accords to those states, and so you can't force them to disarm, and doing enforcement against one of those states when the system is set up to allow for vetoes by those states is also problematic. So we try to lay out the range of challenges and issues, both technical and political.
George, would you like to add something to that?
I think Toby covered it, really well. I think just one thing about the political assumption we make that kind of reinforces what he said, which is we don't think that you can force a state to give up nuclear weapons, as Toby said, including North Korea. So the assumption of the paper is that disarmament would have to be negotiated. And that means give and take, which sometimes is hard for people here to understand or accept. But that's the background condition. And then also, we don't assume that political relationships amongst all of the nuclear armed states have become so happy and normal that they don't worry about each other cheating or, the need for a lot of verification, because that's an assumption, that some people make is, look, states won't agree to get rid of their weapons unless all their relations are much better. And so therefore, when that happens, it's not going to be that big a problem to do disarmament. And to us, that's just not a very interesting problem if everybody's that happy with each other. So we're trying to think about, well, what about in an in-between situation where states have come to the conclusion that territorial issues have been more or less resolved, major warfare, they've got some confidence it's not going to happen, but they're still suspicious enough that they would worry about reconstitution, that somebody who would agree to disarm might secretly try to reconstitute. And so what would that package look like? That's kind of the spot that we were trying to explore.
And with this monograph just out, what kind of impact are you expecting for it in the U.S. debate and internationally?
I think that one of the challenges of sort of situating yourself between two camps is that often you take incoming from both and make nobody happy. And so I would expect that for the disarmers will be seen as too close to kind of protecting nuclear weapons interests, and for those who favor deterrence, this will be seen as kind of an illegitimate thinking of the unthinkable. And so it's with these kinds of papers, it's hard to know whether it actually spurs new research or helps people to sort of clarify what a research agenda would look like, which is certainly our hope, to encourage and motivate new thinking, new research, and so forth. And ultimately, I think it comes down to the observation that we concluded with, which is that this problem isn't going away and it's not getting better. If anything, it's getting worse. And only by confronting these kinds of questions in a more realistic fashion, without the kind of airy-fairy assumptions that often go with the narratives of either camp, that's the only way that you can really make progress. Now, that progress might be messy. There might be an increase in polarization as you get into these hard questions and you see that states and peoples don't want to address them in a realistic way. But ultimately for us, we felt like it was most honest and intellectually appropriate to kind of pursue this in that way, and hope that others will join us on this journey.
George, anything?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think Toby said, well, I mean, the thought was that experts around the world from multiple perspectives, those who favor prohibition and disarmament, those who favor either forever deterrence or as a necessary condition now, and as well as those states, could actually find something interesting in thinking through the details of how you would actually do disarmament. And if you could do that in an open way, it could create a common conversation, not common ground in the sense of common answer, at least a conversation on a problem that all of them would agree, okay, it's an interesting thing and worthwhile doing. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're not naive. So as Toby said, I mean, you know, personally, I don't know if people read more than tweets anymore. So, you know, this is kind of a long paper. How many people are going to read it? I have no idea. And then, as we all know, things are very, very polarized now. So you're kind of a sap if you're in the middle, trying to say, hey, can't we all just talk and you know, have a serious conversation? So I'm hoping to be really pleasantly surprised that A, anybody reads it, and B, actually it produces a serious conversation. That would be great.
Well, the monograph series is a bet that there is a readership. And so far our feedback has been positive. I don't think we necessarily reach a very large community, but it's clear that there is an appetite for deeper strategic thought than we've so far experienced as a large community since the end of the Cold War. And I find a lot of resonance with this work, even if not a large distribution of it. So, but thank you for making the time to contribute this piece of analysis and thought-provoking agenda setting for all of us. Let me ask if there's anything you'd like to say in closing. Anything else?
Well, I was just going to add one other thing, Brad, which is that, you know, I think that oftentimes these political policy problems ultimately also demand thinking from the scientific community. And to the extent that, you know, having a paper like this published through CGSR and then the distribution within the lab system, I think that's where a lot of this thinking is going to have to be generated from, as you navigate a lot of the technical challenges that we lay out. And so our hope would be for future conversations with your colleagues in the lab system on these issues as well.
Thank you.
No, and thanks for the opportunity, Brad. I mean, we both have read all the papers in your series and really admire them precisely because they're very serious and kind of balanced in their approach. And so we welcome the opportunity to do this as well. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much for saying that, George, and thank you for your addition to the collection. And let's hope it has a significant impact on the thinking of people in our communities and more broadly. Right. At this point, we'll stand adjourned and return to our separate lives in virtual reality. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, man. Thanks, Katie. Thanks a lot.